Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to New Wave. I'm Rabia Mehmood. New Wave is an independent news site which looks at the world through a South Asian lens. Please do subscribe, like, and comment on our discussions. Our guest today is Sangeeta Goswami, Policy and Advocacy Director at the Human Security Collective, a Netherlands based NGO focusing on security and development worldwide. HSC is also the co founder of the Global Nonprofit Coalition on the Financial Action Task Force, FATF as we know it, and works on building a gap between the FATF and NGOs across the world. Why is that so? Because FATF, a G7 task force initially created to control money laundering in the 90s and then to counter terrorist financing, has been used as a means to restrict the NGO sector the world over, or the civil society, and even political opposition in quite a few countries, including in South Asia, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. To and we also know FATF in Pakistan because Pakistan was on its grey list, and then in 2018, and by 2022 late quarter, it was removed from that grey list. So that's how we were introduced to FATF. But FATF has been impacting a lot of what the kind of policies which the Pakistan government has put in place, and like the rest of countries in South Asia has had put in place while dealing with the nonprofits or the NGOs from behind closed doors. And Sangeeta is going to tell us more about this. Sangeeta, welcome to New Wave Global.
Thank you, Rabia. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Thanks again. And so let's start with the basic. How is FATF so strong? What is it, and what's its connection to NGO restriction in everywhere in the world, and of course in South Asia?
Yeah, thanks. Gosh, that's a that's a big question. But yeah, so the Financial Action Task Force is an intergovernmental body which was sort of set up years ago in '89 to tackle money laundering. And this was sort of largely US driven because there was a lot of, there were a lot of drugs coming in from Latin America and the monies of which were being laundered in the US. So they wanted a task force of, the big economies to kind of deal with this. But that changed post 9/11 and the terrorist attacks that happened in September on US soil when largely pushed by the US, they decided that, this whole thing about following the money, when it came to terrorism attacks. So the whole concept of terrorism financing, for example, and the countering of it also needed to sit with this task force. So initially a money laundering task force, it was then tasked with countering terrorism financing. Two very different things, as you can well imagine. But I think, pushed by the US, this body very quickly in 2001, within a matter of weeks, developed these standards, normative standards on countering the financing of terrorism. And your question on how nonprofit organizations are implicated in this, one of those 11 standards that were developed happened to be on NGOs, NPOs, nonprofit organizations, as they term them, so charities, because there was some evidence at that point that was presented in a Senate hearing in the US that bin Laden, who was the architect of those attacks, had used some charity formation to transfer some of the money that funded those attacks on US soil. So at a stroke, in one fell swoop, all NGOs were sort of tarnished with this sort of discourse of being particularly vulnerable to terrorism financing. And we had a whole standard developed for our sector, which talked about regulating the sector for terrorism financing abuse, overseeing the sector for terrorism financing abuse, etc. And it was actually the only legal entity that had a recommendation of its own in the FATF standards, and that stands still today. It is the only legal entity with an entire recommendation of its own. So there is a kind of exceptionalism which has been meted out to the sector in the last 20 plus years or so. And, that has led to enormous harm, and I'm happy to talk about that as well in a bit.
Yeah, thank you. And so that's what's so worrying, right? A lot of people in the NGO sector, as we call them, I mean, this is the non-profit sector, it's the formal term, but like in the civil society, in the, the world over, they, some do, but they don't even understand where the restrictions are coming from, right? And you see that, and it's also interesting, right? Because the restrictions are coming from a set number of countries which have a say in this, and these countries are also engaged in supporting human rights work in those respective countries. So it's kind of, it's a bit strange to have both of these things happening at the same time. And I see that sometimes missing from the advocacy when it comes to defense of human rights defenders, or sort of when we speak about XYZs being implicated in a case by our government, and for instance the NGOs and human rights defenders, and we don't really mention this big, like, people don't even know about this white elephant, right? For instance, in Pakistan there was a human rights defender. There were two human rights defenders, a father and daughter, and they had an NGO. And then that case, the Gulalai Ismail case in 2019 onwards, was a very classic case because the FIRs, the first information reports against them, were about terrorist financing. They were based in KP. They were award winning. Their work on women's and girls' education, they were award winning NGO, very secular and very recognized across the world in Pakistan. And then all of a sudden, they were terrorist financing cases against them.
Yeah.
And throughout the advocacy on that case, it was never really mentioned what this means. What does terrorist financing means? It started in 2019 and went up till 2022 onwards, essentially the same time period that Pakistan was on the gray list
Yeah.
for or FATF, and we'll speak about why. And then there is more about what India has done, for instance. There
Mhm.
has very thorough documentation of misusing of
Mhm.
the FATF standards and this
Mhm.
recommendation.
Mhm.
So can you speak to us more about this misuse and what exactly, how
Yeah.
is it that this recommendation emboldens our
Yeah.
countries? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, great question, Rabia. And yeah, I actually, yeah, we at HSC, we know Gulalai quite well and her case, etc. But yes, I think, yeah, very soon after these standards were put in place, actually, colleagues of ours at HSC who were working on, with civil society around the world started getting reports of, non-profits, not NGOs, charities having difficulties registering or having difficulties, accessing money. And they couldn't quite understand where these restrictions were coming from. And in sometimes, being harassed or, organizations being shut down. And it seemed, it didn't seem random. It seemed, quite systemic to them. And when they dug around a little bit, so this would have been in 2005, 2006, they figured, oh, actually there's this intergovernmental body called the FATF who has this standard, and countries need to implement laws to comply with those standards. And that's where some of this was initially coming from. And that's when the Global Nonprofit Coalition was set up. And it's a loose coalition of sort of now about 500, 550 members around the world that works to sort of raise awareness on this sort of otherwise quite, in the dark, in the shadows body and what it does, and how countries are implementing its rules and regulations, but also to sort of advocate to mitigate some of the harms caused by this framework. And as you rightly said, um, you know, governments find ways of misusing or abusing this standard. And because the standard has also come a long way. In the beginning it said nonprofits were particularly vulnerable to terrorism financing abuse, and that was of course not true, because there was no empirical evidence to show that there was the widespread abuse of the sector for terrorism financing. And that's the evidence that the Global NPO Coalition and partners and members went to the FATF with and said, look, you can't have this sort of blanket statement that all charities, all nonprofits are vulnerable to TF abuse. And that's when they changed the language, a few years down the line, came up with, a risk-based approach that countries need to have a more nuanced approach when they regulate the sector, when they oversee the sector. And going forward, I mean, they have changed the standard considerably, including sort of latest changes in 2023, making clear, that countries should use a risk-based approach, that countries should regulate appropriately based on the level of risk, based on the context, etc. And most importantly, should not hamper legitimate charitable activity. But all of that is, of course, on paper. But the thing is that, when it comes to terrorism, and that's why, I said at the beginning that, clubbing sort of the anti-money laundering framework with the counterterrorism financing framework is, those are two very strange bedfellows, so to speak, and as a research piece pointed out many years ago. But because in sort of the universal standards there is no definition of terrorism. So in the UN there is no agreed upon definition of terrorism. So of course there is no agreed upon definition of terrorism financing. So it's up to states to define what terrorism is, what terrorism financing is. And that's where you see this sort of the scope for abuse. And that's what's happening in many countries around the world, including in South Asia, where legitimate nonprofit organizations, human rights defenders, or anybody who doesn't suit the current dispensation's sort of ideology or their vision of what they're doing is sort of classed as a terrorist or an anti-national, and then it's easy to then bring the weight of that framework to bear down on these organizations or individuals, using these sort of laws and regulations that are put in place to deal with actual terrorists and actual terrorism financing. But what is actual terrorism and actual terrorism financing is up to the state to define, and that's where there is the sort of gap between what the normative standard sets out and how it's implemented in country. And that's where we see state institutions being abused, laws being abused, and of course the victims of that are individuals, community members, civil society organizations. And yes, while it's the same countries who often who are sitting at the FATF who often advocate for human rights, the thing is that um, the FATF sees itself as a very sort of technical body, and representations to FATF are often ministries of treasury, so the finance ministries. And of course, the human rights bit often sits under different ministries. So there is no sort of they see themselves solely as countering illicit financial flows, whether that's money laundering or terrorism financing, and that's their remit as ministries of finance. And what we've been trying to do as the Global NPO Coalition is to say that you cannot ignore these other equities. You cannot look at policies in silos. You have to insert those equities of that countries are also signed up to: freedom of expression, freedom of association, the other rights and development and sustainable development goal equities need to also feature in how you're implementing your standards, or even how you're writing those standards, or how you're putting them in place. So I think we are, initially the FATF, in 2013-14 would say, but we are not a human rights organization. And then, we've pushed back, and I think now they realize that, they do need to do something about it. And when they set up this unintended consequences work stream, because they realized that there had been unintended consequences of the implementation of their standards. One of the unintended consequences they set out was this very thing, that human rights and due process was being impeded and impacted by the misimplementation of their standards. Of course, you can question whether it's willful misimplementation, which in many authoritarian countries it is. So we are still fighting those battles. I think the standards themselves are fairly watertight now. I mean, there is room for improvement, but of course, it's at the implementation stage where we struggle most.
Thanks for this, very insightful response to what my question was. But it also, what you mentioned about, that FATF has recognized that there were unintended consequences of that recommendation and all. But I would say the damage has been done now in terms of governments introducing certain policies and certain laws, which and now all of this exists, right? And even if there are country specific reports in which they mention that, oh, allow civil society to operate in a way that they're not victims of any repressive tactic, and like ensure that anti money laundering cases or CFT cases are not subjected to unfair trials or lengthy trials and whatnot. These are just some of the things which I was reading up on in country reports. But the but there is enough teeth associated with FATF recommendations for some reason, although they're not supposed to, right? And when at the same time you have other international human rights frameworks by under the United Nations Convention, some of which are binding and the states are signatory to, on civil political rights and whatnot. Those have those are just recommendations. They're no teeth affiliated with those conventions and their compliances. Why is that there is this difference? You probably get this question a lot, but if you can just explain to us as to why this difference, and
Yeah.
why is it that the human rights sector, I mean, that's maybe not the right question for you in terms of, I mean, I don't want to put this pressure on you. Why is it that the sector at large, and even media and civil society across the world, have kind of failed to you know get sort of make our frameworks which help people more stronger? But then you have this G7 task force. I'm going to keep on calling it a G7 task force, which is so powerful.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great question again. But and it's something that, people often ponder about, why is it so powerful? Because, in spite of it not being a treaty body, as you say, it's just a task force, and it just has what, 39 odd members, of mostly the richest economies of the world, who are making standards for the rest of the world, which the rest of the world somehow feels obligated to sort of implement. And why is that? It's because a couple of things. It's because the FATF has a sort of a methodology uh, by which they assess countries. So countries are assessed it used to be once a decade, now it's going to be once every 5-7 years. And they are assessed on all of the recommendations. So the 40 recommendations currently on anti-money laundering, counterterrorism financing, and counter-proliferation financing. And it's sort of in two parts. So whether a country has all the laws, regulations in place, so sort of a more technical compliance bit, and effectiveness. So whether those laws, rules, regulations are actually effective at stopping money laundering and terrorism financing, etc. And what this evaluation does, and it's often a peer evaluation, so your peer countries evaluate you, and the report is made public. And you're given a mark basically on each of the recommendations. So whether you're compliant or non-compliant, and on effectiveness, whether you're moderately effective or not effective. And the thing is, because it's public, so there is a degree of naming and shaming there. And if you do really badly, so if you fail on numerous things, then you get onto this gray list, or worse still, a blacklist. There is that public facing element of it. And more than that, I think if you get a bad score and you somehow end up on a gray list, which some countries do, then it impacts trade and aid greatly. And I think the second bit of this is, because sort of the world economy revolves around the dollar. So the dollar is the world's reserve currency, which is why, if and sort of the whole FATF framework is predicated on that, on the dollar being sort of the reserve currency. And the moment there's a bad report and you get on the gray list, or everybody gets jittery, and then it tells on a country's aid and trade. So it is extremely powerful in that sense. So countries fall over themselves to try and get it right in the process, sort of. And as I was saying, this whole NGO standard is an outlier amidst it all, right? Often the people who go to assess countries are law enforcement, or people from the judiciary, or people from who have a financial crime background, have no idea what the NGO sector is, what it looks like, what it does, and it's such a different beast. It's such a complex beast, and it's sort of an outlier in this whole, illicit financial flow framework. So nobody quite knows how to assess it, and which is why we end up with all this overregulation. Sometimes countries just feel they have to overregulate the sector to get a good mark. But I think the changes that the FATF has made, again, to your earlier question, on how can things change because laws and regulations are already in place. I think what the FATF has done is changed the standard sufficiently, so that now when assessors go into a country, they are going to assess countries from 2025 according to the new standard, or the revised standard. And if they see that there's overregulation, if they see that there's suppression, if they see that there's that legitimate charity work or NGO work is impacted, they can actually mark a country down. So there are now certain disincentives to overregulate the sector, but we'll see how it works. I mean, we're not entirely sure, because it's still largely sort of a very tick box exercise, and we're not sure how equipped the assessors are, to actually ask the right questions when they go into a country, to meet with the right NGOs, etc. So as a coalition, we're still working on these things with the FATF. But, we're hoping that in due course, some of this will change, and hopefully countries will then be able to also change their laws, because in many countries around the world, actually it states in law that NGOs are high risk for terrorism financing. And then when it states that in law, then banks or other service providers have to do enhanced due diligence checks. So it's this whole cycle, if it's already there in law. And this discourse seems so prevalent, and perceptions are so sticky. In 2001, when they said NGOs are particularly vulnerable, you still see that to this day. That whenever there's a news report or something, it's always about oh, the sector is vulnerable to terrorism financing. One case, and the whole sector is tarnished with that. So discourse and perception is quite sticky in that sense when it comes to our sector, and so it's an uphill task trying to change all of that as well.
True, true. And yes, and there are these sort of contradictions which exist in this whole setup. They are giving money to foreign governments, are giving money to countries and non-profit sector, and trying to, for education, for rights, for democracy, rule of law. And at the same time, you have these laws which are implemented by, and these frameworks which are set in place in our countries, which restrict funding access to for human rights actors, but others can access it. But
Mhm.
the human rights organizations cannot. I have more questions about the powerful nature of FATF as a body, but like I will come to that later on. But your answer and what we've read up on this establishes that it's so powerful because of money, right? If
Exactly. And even if I can just add something, Rabia, what you were saying, this whole foreign funding rules and regulations that are put in place, it's because sort of money is also seen as, a carrier of value, right? And governments often prefer some types of values, but not others. And so they try and sort of regulate that. And, countries have had these, and it's proliferating widely now, this whole, regulation of inflows of money into a country, and particular money streams are okay, but particular money streams are not. And that obviously has an impact on rights defenders, for example, or climate activists, or any of those kinds of works, usually in a country, but also others. And it greatly impacts freedom of expression and association. Yeah, but sorry, that was just a sort of to
No,
add that there. Yeah,
no, you're right, because I mean, there's the sector and people are also very demonized, long been
yeah,
demonized in
yeah,
not our countries, rest in certain other countries as well. Now we're saying this happening in the US as well. So a certain kind of protest is allowed in Germany, and another kind of a protest is
yeah,
not allowed.
yeah,
So,
absolutely.
and that's kind of that's a problem which everyone is confronted with. Um, and then you kind of sort of mix it up with a certain policy or legislation, and the demonization, and then you have a recipe for disaster. Uh, um, so okay, so first a technical question. You engage with FATF, but if FATF also has in other regional groups which are FATF style bodies, which so for instance, Pakistan is member of Asia Pacific Group, which is a FATF style regional body which looks at money laundering, and specifically, I mean, that's what it says. Do you also engage with them, or
Yeah,
in any capacity, and
yeah.
how? Yeah, can you speak about
Yeah,
a
no,
bit?
absolutely. So actually, as I was saying, the Central Financial Action Task Force just has, those 39 members, which are, the world's largest economy. So everybody else is a member of an FATF style regional body, and there are nine of these spread across the world. And yeah, APG, of course, is for, the Asia Pacific Group on money laundering. And, these are sort of legacy names, right? They were the Asia Pacific Group on money laundering before the counterterrorism financing stuff was, put on the FATF's plate. So that sort of, it tells you also the legacy. It's one of sort of the earlier FATF style regional bodies. But yeah, so we do engage with these regional bodies. It's essential too, because they are the ones who are coordinating the mutual evaluations of the countries that fall under them. And so equally they need to be trained, their assessors need to be trained, from an NGO perspective on the recommendation that affects NGOs, and uh, other related matters. So yes, we do engage with them as well.
Okay, so coming back to the FATF being a powerful, body. To me it looks like that they are the big global bullies, and then they bully other countries, and then the countries bully their whoever they want to in their country, in within the state, right? Like journalists, human rights activists, political opposition, political dissidents, whoever they want to. But these, it's also it's interesting how these 39 countries, the world's largest economies, as you are calling them, everyone who has a seat on the table, it's Russia is no more a part of the 39 countries, or were they 40 and now it's 39?
Yeah, no, it was 39, and then Russia was expelled, and then Indonesia was inducted into the club, so to speak.
Okay,
So yeah, it's back to
okay.
39.
Good for Indonesia, but
Well,
well, yes, but so Russia was removed, and one of the reasons was also financing of weapons of mass destruction. And it was not just, money laundering or counterterrorism financing, and it was linked to the Ukraine war. And you still see there are other countries who are engaged in really violent behavior. For instance, Israel still gets to be there because, and Israel is getting everything that it needs from through the Western countries. For instance, the US, Germany, France, the
yeah,
United Kingdom, and whatnot. And its weapons of mass destructions are being given to it very publicly through legal means. And so there is that. It's not, this is just one example, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
uh, And I think you've mentioned before that there's been research which calls it sort of still like a colonial framework. Can you speak to us a bit about that? Like that, about, yeah,
Yeah, no,
FATF
absolutely. I mean,
colonial
Russia is no, yeah, yeah,
or an
sorry. Russia
extension?
is no longer part of the FATF, but they're still part of the Eurasia group, which is the FATF style regional body. In fact, that's hosted in Moscow. So yeah, it's all a bit confusing, and but actually not so much, because it is after all, as you were saying, and as academics have called it, regulatory colonialism by other means, I think. So yes, and as you were talking, some countries are more equal than others in this framework. For example, when Israel um, brought allegations of terrorism financing against 5 human rights activists organizations in Palestine, including well-known ones like Al-Haq, who
I'll
we
have.
work with, etc. Um, and we wrote to the FATF at that point saying these are spurious allegations and they are sort of misusing the FATF framework to tarnish, well-known civil society organizations. We got a really anodyne response back from the then German president of the FATF, saying, yeah, but it's outside their mutual evaluation cycle right now, so we can't really do anything about it, etc. So and then, of course, the EU and others took stances saying that, no, I mean, there was no evidence, after a lot of investigation. And so they renewed their funding to these organizations. And it turned out that the allegations were spurious. But again, the FATF will do something in some cases and won't in others. But again, what is the FATF? It is, after all, these countries, right? I mean, as a body, it is those members who make up the FATF. So, what you see in the multilateral system today, you also see, I think, in the FATF. And I think for a long time, the FATF thought of itself as just a technical body countering illicit financial flows. And who can be against that, right? Countering illicit financial flows. But the thing is that, terrorism and terrorism financing is anything but technical, right? What do you do about state terrorism, for example? And, that is sort of pushed under the carpet. Nobody speaks about that. So in that sense, we did a foresight piece at HSC a year and a bit ago, talking about what next for recommendation 8. Should we abolish it altogether? Because anyway, it's an outlier. It doesn't fit within that whole framework. And also we asked larger questions like, actually, should FATF just deal with money laundering and other illicit financial flows, and terrorism financing and the countering of it should actually sit somewhere else, maybe with the UN, within, with the sanctions stuff, because it is, it seems strange that it sits with a body with just, few members at the policy making table, and when it is in effect, such a political and discussion. So yeah, so there are lots of problems, and then you see that, when it comes to in-country implementation.
Hmm. Sangeeta, thanks very much for your responses. And this was very informative for us, and I hope for our viewers as well. Thanks to our viewers for watching today. Khuda Hafiz.